Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listeners. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. On tonight's episode, we delve into tales of lurking dread and unseen terrors. Stories that remind us that sometimes what we don't see is far scarier than what we do. With two terrifying tales, tonight's journey takes us into the eerie unknown. I'm your host, Geoff Sturtevant, and tonight I'll be your guide as we traverse the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. Before we begin, remember that your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're tuning in. Watching on YouTube? Give us a thumbs up, drop a comment, and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Don't forget to ring the bell icon to stay updated on all our new releases. For even more spine-chilling content, visit chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can become a patron and enjoy ad-free episodes. Your support helps us keep bringing the nightmares to life. Thank you. Joining me tonight is a very special guest, someone whose passion for horror storytelling has captivated audiences across the web. Please welcome Felipe Ojeda of the YouTube channel TheGhostOf94. Felipe is an audio engineer, musician, and voice actor who has worked with us here at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights for many years in the past and continues to explore new projects with us. Felipe, it's a pleasure to have you here. 2 questions. First of all, why do you always insist on outdressing me? Second, why don't you tell our listeners a little more about yourself?
Thank you, Geoff. It's an honor to be here. And well, to answer your first question, my hard hat and work boots, I feel, reminds people of a simpler time, back when it was still cool to dance along to the YMCA. Plus, I don't remember a UPS driver in the dance group. For those unfamiliar with me, I'm the creator of TheGhostOf94, a YouTube channel where I produce a variety of horror-themed content. Everything from single narrator stories to full-cast radio play-style audiobooks. I handle the original music, sound design, and narration myself to create immersive experiences. My journey into the world of horror narration started years ago when I was commuting for work as a construction worker. I stumbled upon creepypasta narrations and they became my go-to during long drives. Later, I studied commercial music and sound engineering in college, which eventually led me to throw my hat in the ring as an audio engineer for Chilling Tales for Dark Nights back in 2015. Man, hard to believe it's already been 10 years, am I right? Anyway, from there, I worked on several podcasts and honed my skills until I was ready to launch my channel. I'm so grateful to have been part of this incredible community, and it's exciting to still collaborate with you all.
It's inspiring to hear how a passion for storytelling can turn into a rewarding creative endeavor. Felipe, you've certainly made your mark in the horror community. And speaking of exciting projects, I hear you've got something special lined up for tomorrow.
That's right, Geoff. Tomorrow I'll be premiering a narration of an original story by Chilling Tales for Dark Nights creator Craig Groshek on my YouTube channel, TheGhostOf94. The title is a surprise, but I promise, It's a tale as terrifying as it is masterful. I've poured everything into the sound design and narration, and I can't wait for everyone to experience it. Be sure to tune in tomorrow, Thursday, January 23rd, 2025, to check it out.
You heard it here first, listeners. Make sure to subscribe to The Ghost of 94 and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. He's got some great stuff on there, including some projects I was lucky enough to be involved in. Check out The Dead and the Dying. Really awesome stuff. Now, let's dive into our first story. Our first tale tonight comes from the mind of Ryan Peacock. In this unsettling narrative, a man's nightly drives to calm his anxiety lead him to strange encounters with roadside construction workers who are anything but ordinary. So without further ado, as narrated and produced by the illustrious Felipe Ojeda, here's Have You Seen Them? The Construction Workers.
Have you seen them? The construction workers? Have you seen them? Working on the roads at night? Always busy, but it's never clear just what they're working on. I've seen them, and I know they've seen me. Sorry, I'm a little drunk right now, so forgive me if this isn't the most coherent. I'm hoping the alcohol will help calm my nerves enough so I can sleep, even if just for a little while. I don't really get a lot of sleep in the first place. I never have. Ever since I was really young, I've always had the worst insomnia. I'll lay in bed, but my brain just won't shut off. My thoughts race at 1,000 miles per minute, and I can't make them stop. Questions, worries, self-doubts, the list goes on. I'm an anxious man by nature. The calm that one needs to drift off doesn't come easily to me, and sleep only comes quickly when I'm well and truly exhausted. Sometimes I'll go on my phone, but that really doesn't help. I just stay up browsing all night. Sometimes I'll get up and play a video game or something. But really, that's no better than spending the night on my phone. So lately, I've been driving. I don't know about you, but driving calms me down. It soothes my nerves. My mind doesn't race or anything. I forget about the anxiety. I can just sit and focus on the road or whatever I'm listening to. The podcast, some music, whatever. Lately I've been listening to creepypasta. That John Grills has a very calming voice. I'll go out on the road for a couple of hours and drive through the dark country roads. Sometimes I'll pass through nearby towns and take in the surreal beauty of them. Quiet and abandoned in the early hours of the morning. If you've never seen it, you should. It's something special. There's something so serene about being the only one around in the dead of night. It makes my heart race and, in a way, makes my anxiety spike. But I love it. Anyways, it was during one of those drives that I saw them. I never put that much thought into the random construction workers I'd sometimes pass. I just slowed down and make a point not to hit them, like a decent human being. They'd go about their business, and I'd go about mine. Nobody ever really thinks that hard about road work. It's just sort of a little annoying thing you deal with. If there's a lot of traffic, it's frustrating, but usually it's just a mild annoyance at best. Sometimes, while passing their work sites, I catch a glimpse of the workers and briefly imagine myself living their lives, scheduling my life around the late-night construction shifts. I've never really been one for manual labor. I don't don't think I could do it, but I admire those who could. Most of the construction workers I've seen on my drives were just ordinary people, up past midnight fixing potholes. Most of them. Every now and again, I'd see something different, and I'm not entirely sure how to describe it. See, while I was out on my late-night drives, I'd sometimes pass work sites that hadn't been there during the day. I know. That doesn't sound that weird when you say it out loud. A lot of road work gets done at night, when there's less traffic out and about. But stay with me here. I know the area I drive pretty well. I'd know if they were doing road work in those areas during the day. They weren't. And the road work they were doing at night, well, I'm not entirely sure if I could call it road work. These work sites had a setup like they were doing road work, with orange and black construction pylons keeping cars away from their work sites. But they didn't really seem to be actually working on the road. I only ever caught a few glimpses of what they were doing, but in every instance that I saw them, there was always a car in the sectioned off part of the road, and they were always doing something to it. Does that even qualify as road work? Then there were the workers themselves. If you've driven past a construction zone at night, you might have made eye contact with some random worker. If so, you know that it's a very surreal moment. Kinda uncomfortable. But I mean, you're still just looking at a person. Passing these guys, though, something just felt off about them. They'd always be tall and skinny. As in, weirdly tall and skinny. They'd be dressed in baggy uniforms, and their facial features never seemed quite right. Their hair looked like a badly done wig. Some of them were inexplicably wearing sunglasses, and those that weren't just had a sort of vacant look in their eyes. The weirdest part was how they all just sort of stop and look at me as I drove by. In unison, they'd just stop what they were doing and just stare, eyes fixated on my car as I passed, as if they were waiting for me to leave. The first few times I saw them, I never thought too much of it. I mean, you see weird-looking people all the time. It's not exactly unfathomable that some of them might work in construction. What they were doing was never really my business anyways. But as I started seeing them more and more over the next few months, those little weird traits they had stood out to me more and more. Like I said before, I never thought about it too much. If anything, it was just one of those funny things you see while driving at night, and I never mentioned it to anybody. Why would I? Whatever they were doing, it wasn't any of my concern. And I guess it was really never any of my concern now that I'm thinking about it. I don't know. But I couldn't really leave well enough alone. Not after seeing what I saw. I'm beating around the bush. I'm sorry. Putting it all into writing is hard, and I'm overthinking every little detail. I'll try to get to the point. It was a few days ago, and I was in the middle of another bout of insomnia, so I did what I always do. I went for a drive. I didn't want to go too far from home, so I stayed in town for the most part, skirting along some more rural roads as I drove a familiar circuit I'd driven 1,000 times before. I put on a podcast and let myself relax. It was nice and soothing. After about a half an hour or so, I was skirting along one of the roads that separated the suburbs from the endless farmland that dominated the back roads, and I saw the orange and black pylons up ahead. I cut my speed and moved into the other lane to give the construction a wide berth. As I passed the construction, I spotted a white pickup truck inside the pylons. This didn't look like a work truck. It had way too many bumper stickers, most of them referencing God. The truck was idling, but I didn't see any trace of the driver inside. Only several tall, pale figures working on the body of the truck, and as I passed, they all turned to look at me, fixing me in wide, unblinking stares. I looked back at them only briefly as I slowly drove past. On the ground a few feet away were about 4 or 5 other workers. They were standing around something I didn't immediately get a good look at. Like their buddies, they all stared vacantly at me as well. And as I drove past, I caught a glimpse of just what it was they were standing over, and I almost stopped the car. It was hard to see clearly between the figures, but I could have sworn there was a man laying on the ground. No, that's not the right phrasing. That implies I have any doubt about what I saw. I did see a man laying on the ground. I saw him looking at me, his eyes locking with mine for a moment as I sat inside my car. I saw that he was terrified. That look, I don't know how to describe it really. It felt like it pierced my very soul and left me slightly sick to my stomach. I've never been face to face with a man who knew he was about to die before. I've never had someone beg me for help with just their eyes. But that night, I was sure that was exactly what I was looking at. And the longer I looked, the more I realized what was off. The man they stood over didn't appear to have any legs. He was pale as a ghost, and there were dark stains on the hands and uniforms of the workers. Stains that looked an awful lot like blood. I stared at them. I stared at the man, and they all stared right back at me, silently warning me off. I took the hint. I hit the gas and sped away from the roadwork. Looking in my rearview mirror, I could see every tall, pale figure at the construction site still staring at me as the darkness of the night consumed them again. My mind was racing as I left the scene of the roadwork behind. I tried to understand what I'd just seen, but no answer really seemed satisfying. Maybe they'd been helping someone who got into an accident. But why were the construction workers doing that? Why were they set up around his car like that? There'd been nothing else they'd seemed to be working on. I had many questions, and none of them made any sense. I tried to justify it in my mind, but every logical explanation I came up with collapsed in on itself. Maybe it was just that my mind was tired. I wasn't thinking straight. Maybe it would all make sense in the morning. Maybe. After driving for a little while longer, I eventually found my way back home, went up to my apartment, and collapsed into my bed. I wish I could say I slept soundly, but I didn't. Not even close. Come morning, I was inclined to dismiss everything I'd seen the night before as some sort of bad dream or exhaustion-induced misunderstanding. I mean, realistically, what were the chances that there was anything suspicious going on out there? Probably zero, right? And yet, I still couldn't shake the memory of the man watching me from the ground as the workers surrounded him. I still couldn't justify the fact that those workers looked to be covered in blood. Perhaps it was just an accident. Perhaps. I don't know. But if it were, wouldn't there be some record of it? When the idea crossed my mind, I had to look into it more. I scoured the local news, looking for some references of a car accident last night, but found nothing. That in and of itself shouldn't have been too suspicious, right? The news can't cover every little fender bender. What was I saying? This wasn't a little fender bender. In the best case scenario, that man had to have been at least injured. There'd been no other cars at the scene, so he had to have crashed into something. A guardrail or signpost. Something. That was it. If he'd hit something on the road, there would have been some sign of it, wouldn't there? It hadn't looked like his truck had hit anything when I passed him, but, well, it had also been dark, and I hadn't stuck around for long. I still had some time before work started. I could drive down and get a coffee and a donut, take that road and see what damage was done. It would alleviate all my fears. No problem. So that's exactly what I did. I took a long route to pass by the spot where I'd seen the accident, and I expected to see pylons or even a police car. Judging by the time, the accident had only been about 6 hours ago. There probably wouldn't be any trace of the truck or its driver, but I had little doubt I'd see what they'd hit. And yet, as I drove down the highway, I saw nothing. I'd never really stopped to closely study the signs and guardrails along that road before, or more accurately, the lack of them. What few rails and signs I saw had no damage, and when I passed the area I'd seen the truck in, there was nothing there that it could have hit. Let's say the driver had been drunk and had gone off the road. He would have ended up in the farmer's field. Perhaps he had, and those workers had carried him out. But wouldn't there be some sign of it? Some evidence? I saw none. I passed that way a second time after getting my coffee to get out and take a closer look, on the off chance I could find more evidence. The golden glow of the rising sun didn't offer the best light to investigate in, but as far as I could tell, there was absolutely nothing. No sign of anything that had gone off the road. No evidence of bloodstains. No chipped pieces of paint or signs of damage. Nothing at all. I almost wondered if I was in the wrong place and spent the next 15 minutes walking up and down the stretch of highway looking for something. And yet, there was still nothing. After a while, I got back into my car and went home to start work. As I meandered throughout my workday, my mind kept wandering back to the car accident from last night. Why did this matter to me? Why was I putting so much effort into this when really, it shouldn't matter? Was it the look in the man's eyes? Why would that drive me? I sat mindlessly at my laptop, replaying those precious few seconds I'd shared with him over and over again in my head as I'd driven past. Maybe it was the fear that I saw, a mortal fear that was hard to describe. But that was stupid, wasn't it? This shouldn't be bothering me. Why was it bothering me? When I had a moment, I scanned the news again. I looked for any announcements of recent deaths, and and found nothing of note. Eventually, I gave myself 2 shots of espresso and shifted my focus back to my work. Or as much of my focus as I could spare, at least. Then when my day ended, I had a microwave dinner to cap off my day and played a video game until I got sleepy. I woke up around 1 in the morning. Usually, I wake up gradually, but this was different. I don't have a lot of nightmares, and the ones that I do have are pretty minor. The most recent one I can remember involved me putting too much soap in the sink while washing the dishes, and being terrified that my parents would find out. Don't ask why I thought this was so terrifying. I don't know how to explain it. But the nightmare I'd just woken up from was far more vivid than any of the others. In it, I was back in my car, coasting along that back road and watching as the strange, tall construction worker stood over that man with the Jesus truck. I watched as they tugged at his body, not as if they were trying to help him up, but as if they were trying to take him apart. I'd looked into his eyes as I drove past, and both the man and the workers all stared at me. I got to see the terror in that man's eyes all over again. I got to see the mortal fear he felt, and it was intense enough that I felt it in my own heart, too. I wanted to help him. But the workers were staring at me, eyes burning into me, silently willing me away, warning me with an unspoken threat should I get closer. In my dream, I drove away, just like I'd driven away the night before. I'd woken up in a cold sweat. The knot in my stomach was anything but a dream. And though I tried to lay back down and rest, my brain was wide awake. I didn't feel rested. I still felt exhausted. But after half an hour, sleep wouldn't come, and browsing on my phone quickly felt like a hollow distraction. So I got up, got dressed, and grabbed my keys to go on another drive. I passed by the spot where I'd seen the truck again, although there was still nothing there. No evidence of road work. I didn't linger there for much longer. I moved on. I took a back road that I knew would lead me to one of the small towns just outside the city I live in. I didn't play a podcast this time. I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts for a little while. I don't know what I was expecting or hoping to accomplish. I just figured it would help. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it didn't. I'm not really sure. About roughly an hour into my drive, I noticed a flash of orange just down the highway. Road work. Even from a distance, I recognized the tall, lumbering forms of the workers. These were the men I'd seen before. On instinct, I slowed my car down, pulled over to the side of the road, and killed the engine. My lights went dead and immersed me in darkness. I saw one of the workers look over in my direction. For a moment, I dreaded that they might stare at me, seeing me through the darkness. But they didn't. They just went on their business, seemingly none the wiser. I felt like I was doing something wrong, or at least I was doing something weird, spying on random construction workers. These probably weren't even the same guys I'd seen the night before. I mean, they looked similar, but I had no proof. But I still figured I'd watch them for 20 minutes or so before getting bored and driving off. I'd probably spook the hell out of them, but it would put those nagging voices in my mind at rest. So I sat. I waited. And And in time, I saw. I watched as the workers set something up on the road. Just what, I couldn't say. Some sort of strip right across the highway, though. It came out like a jack. Oddly enough, they didn't seem to mark where it was. They just laid it out, then went back to the safety of their orange cones. I wondered if perhaps this was some sort of road treatment. I never thought it would be anything dangerous, and yet, when the next car came, I've never seen car tires pop before. The sound is hard to forget, as is the smell of burning rubber. The second that car went over whatever they'd put in the road, the tires were shredded. I watched the car skid and struggle to brake before veering off over the side of the road. As it did, I watched the workers approach it, carrying the pylon silently and dutifully. Probably just to help him, right? But if so, why were a few of them picking up whatever they'd laid out across the road? Why did whatever they laid out across the road look like it had spikes on it? I watched as the driver, a man in a warm-looking sweater with a matching scarf, got out. He didn't seem to notice the workers coming towards him at first, and while I considered getting out to check on him, my instincts told me to stay put. The workers were almost on top of him when he finally noticed them. And when he did, I saw his eyes light up a little. He spoke to them warmly, almost like friends. "Hey, sorry, something blew out my tires." And before he could say any more, he trailed off. His eyes followed the pair of workers taking their road spikes off of the road, and I could see him piecing together what had just happened in his mind. His warmth immediately faded away and was replaced with rage, then panic. I heard him yelling at them. "What the hell is going on here? What's your fucking problem?" They didn't seem to care. They just kept drawing ever closer to him. And when they started to grab him, he fought them, screaming and thrashing all the while. But there were too many of them, and only one of him. He fought, but in the end, it meant nothing. In the end, they dragged him to the ground, and his screams of rage all too quickly became screams of pain. I watched as they began to pull him apart, not cut. They had no tools. All they had were their bare hands, and they just pulled. I heard the squelch of flesh being ripped from flesh, the inhuman throaty screams of the man being eviscerated while he was still alive. Then the choking gasps, the horrified sobs, the begging. "Stop. Please stop. Why are you doing this? Please." Then the vomiting, as the horror of what was being done to him settled down upon him. Within about 10 minutes, all was silent. The workers who had pried off parts of his body took them away, disappearing into the night with them like ants carrying pieces of their prey. I watched it all with a growing feeling of nausea in my stomach, and I knew that this was the hell the man I'd seen the other night had gone through. They started on his car next, prying the metal before ripping chunks of it off, once again with only their bare hands. I didn't stay long for that. The spikes were off the road. I didn't want to wait around for them to finish on his car in case they spotted me and decided to make me their next victim. I wasn't stupid enough to drive towards them. For all I knew, they'd seen me and set up yet another spike trap up ahead. Instead, the moment my engine came to life, I made a violent U-turn and hit the gas, speeding away from the workers. In my rearview mirror, I could see them all looking up at me as I fled. I haven't slept well ever since that night. I've barely slept at all. I can't unhear the screams. I can't forget the sound of the flesh being ripped apart. Part of me doesn't want to forget. I saw a report on the news the other day. They found parts of several disassembled vehicles dumped in a nearby lake. Some of them even date back to the 1960s. There was even some video of the vehicles being pulled out. One of them looked like it used to be part of a white pickup truck, and it was even covered in decals and stickers praising Jesus. Hard to say for sure, but I can hazard a guess as to where it came from. I haven't left the house in a few days. I don't think the workers go out in the daylight, but I don't want to chance it. I know they've seen me at least twice now. I don't know if they can find me, but I've seen a lot of construction on the streets outside my window lately, and it seems more active at night.
That was Have You Seen Them? The Construction Workers by Ryan Peacock. Produced and performed masterfully by tonight's special guest host, Felipe Ojeda. Excellent work, buddy. Great story. What resonated most with you about it?
Thank you, Geoff. You're too kind. What struck me is how the story builds tension so effectively through small, unsettling details. The way the workers are described. Tall, unnervingly skinny, and always watching. It taps into that primal fear of being observed by something you can't understand.
Totally. And Felipe, for listeners who want to hear more of your work, where can they find you online?
Excellent question, Geoff. Of course, you can find me on YouTube at TheGhostOf94. I'm also on X, Reddit, and Instagram under the same name, where I share updates about my projects and interact with fans. And don't forget to check out tomorrow's premiere of Craig Groshek's story. It's going to be a fantastic experience.
So be sure to check out Felipe's work. And don't go anywhere. Our next story takes us into the strange and terrifying world of a man haunted by an unnatural infestation. And this one is epic in scope, nearly 90 minutes long. I hope you brought a sandwich. Felipe worked tirelessly on this narration, pouring his heart into the sound design and storytelling, and he hopes you enjoy every moment of it. I know you will. Stay tuned. Our second tale tonight comes from Aaron Breiterman. In this one, a man's encounter with a peculiar anthill sets off a series of bizarre and horrifying events that escalate beyond his control. Now, as narrated and produced by Felipe Ojeda, here's Anthills.
It is truly amazing just how much pain the human body is able to endure with the proper motivation. For weightlifters and athletes, it's the goal of looking better and becoming stronger that helps them push through the pain of exercise. For those trapped in the monotony of everyday office work, it is their families that keep them working day in and day out through the mental pain of never-ending paperwork. However, the one true motivator that has time and time again proven to be the eternal motivator of humanity now remains trapped in my psyche like a song on an endless loop. That eternal motivator, of course, is fear. The pain that helps me push through at this very moment is that of exhaustion. You see, as I sit in my cold kitchen floor typing this out, I have made a stunning realization. I have been awake for 3 days straight. I didn't even notice until I looked at the calendar, but it's true. You'd think that with all I've endured this last month, I would have gotten somewhat used to my ordeal and the fear would have subsided even a little bit. But no. It's only gotten worse. It's only further lodged its talons into my brain, and it's the only thing keeping me awake and able to transcribe to you what has befallen me. So, as I orate to you my plight, I ask only one thing of you. Please, keep an open mind, okay? My name is Alex. My story begins last month in the middle of November. I would tell you where I live, but there's not much point since soon enough, it won't matter. To give you some perspective on my surroundings, though, let's just say I'm in one of those southwestern states and leave it at that. I work at a car wash. Come to think of it, at the time of writing this, it'll be nearly 3 years I've been working there. It's amazing how fast time flies when you have no aspirations in life, isn't it? You get used to the routine and are so comfortable with it that you don't even question it anymore. You just let your life slip away from you because the idea of changing anything about your routine holds the slight implication that it can all be ripped away from you and you'll have to get comfortable all over again. I did have aspirations for my life, but at one point or another, they just sort of slipped away from me. All of this is to say that I've been working at this job for a very long time. I started off as a janitor and later as a cashier for the interior section. It's one of those nice car washes where you can watch your car get washed from the inside through a glass. Eventually, I moved my way up the line to the point where I'm the guy who helps vacuum and dry off your car outside. It's more physically demanding work than I expected, but the pay is significantly better than the clerical work I was doing before. Well, I've been working at this job for at least 1.5 years, and I thought it was time for me to ask for a promotion. Not a big one, mind you. I wasn't expecting to be made manager or anything, but I don't think it was out of the question to have been given a job with a little more responsibility, right? I knocked on my boss's door with my speech already rehearsed in my head of various job positions I was going to remind him were available. The meeting, however, didn't go as planned. The speech I had planned in my head would have taken me all of 5 minutes. However, the actual conversation only lasted 2.
No,
my boss interrupted at the very mention of the word promotion. No? With all due respect, sir, at least hear me out. What about my time in service here? I've logged more hours than anyone else here besides you, sir. I said, raising my voice slightly.
I understand the time you've put in here, and I appreciate it. But you've got to take into consideration the effort, kid.
Effort? I replied with such disbelief that my voice may as well have been a whisper.
Yes, Alex, effort. You've put in a commendable amount of time here, but time means jack shit when you're only doing the bare minimum. You understand me?
He was standing up out of his chair, leaning across the desk on his hands at this point, staring me down with those judgmental eyes that seemed to scan me for even the slightest sign of weakness.
You think I don't see you slacking off here every damn day? I've owned this business for a long time. I know how this job is supposed to be done. You do the bare minimum to stay employed. And that's what you're going to receive, is the bare minimum employment.
He said with a very serious tone. I sat there for a moment in disbelief while pondering my response. Nothing came to mind, however, and before I came up with anything to say, he sat back in his chair and pointed to the door behind me, ushering me out. To say I was furious would be a colossal understatement. What little of the rest of my workday I remember was spent in a rage-filled haze that seemed to occupy every corner of my mind like a fog. Effort? I kept saying to myself over and over again. I mean, sure, I might go on my phone every now and then during shifts, but who doesn't? Sure, I may take an extra 5 minutes on my lunch break from time to time, but that doesn't make me a slacker. I'm a hard worker, damn it. I know I am. And for this pretentious piece of shit to claim that I wasn't? Well, let's just say I didn't get a very positive reception for the rest of my shift. I don't think I said hello, let alone cracked a smile at a customer for the rest of the day. As my time at work ended and I drove home, I could sense that I was still seething. My grip on the wheel seemed to tighten exponentially, and I had acquired a sort of tunnel vision while driving, similar to when you zone out and stare into nothingness. Noticing that this was probably unsafe and that I was close to my local park, I decided to stop by and go for a walk to clear my head. I always liked the park. There's not much that I can confidently claim to enjoy with my life, but fishing has to be and always will be one of my favorite pastimes. The lake at the park was the only notable body of water near my town, so needless to say, I spent a lot of my free time going there. After a few minutes of walking the path, I decided to sit on the bench overlooking the water. I watched the light shine off of the water's surface for a few peaceful moments and allowed the anger in my heart to subside until all I was left with was a feeling of pure emptiness. A feeling which was quickly refilled again with a newfound sense of depression at my situation. As the newfound grip of sadness took hold of me, I leaned forward and allowed my hand to fall comfortably in between my hands, staring down at the ground ahead, when I noticed something peculiar. There was an anthill in front of my bench across the walking path. Not an uncommon thing, I know. It's a park. Fair to assume there's going to be ants, right? Well, I'd never seen an anthill that looked like this before. Anthill isn't even the proper term to describe it, as there was no hill, just a perfectly cylindrical hole about 2 inches in diameter in the ground that appeared to devour all the surrounding light, making it impossible to see down into it. Coming out of the hole was what appeared to be ants. However, much like their place of residence, they too looked like no other ant species I can ever recall. In the same vanity as their hill, they too were as dark could be. On top of that, the insects were huge. They were at least the size of the tip of my pinky, with very defined mandible teeth that jetted out from their heads quite far. I stared at them for a good 10 seconds, soaking in every detail about their colony I had stumbled across, when suddenly, the rage I had suppressed earlier came back. Only now, it was accompanied by the dose of sadness which had originally filled its place. I don't know what it was. Something about the creatures just disgusted me on a basic primal level and reignited that burning anger I had originally come to the park to lose in the first place. I'm usually a fairly peaceful guy, but the utter, unnatural look of the creatures just disgusted me on a personal level. Becoming annoyed by the fact that these insects had disgusted me so much and reignited my anger, I stood up, kicked dirt over the hole, and stomped on the anthill a few times, and set off back to my car without a second thought. As I said, I'm usually a fairly peaceful guy. However, I'd been lying if I said it didn't feel good to let out some of that pent-up aggression from that day. The rest of my day went off without a hitch. I went back home, watched some TV, and made dinner just like any other night. Everything appeared to be normal, with one exception. As I attempted to toss and turn my way to sleep that night, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Now let me clarify, I'm not just talking about that feeling you get that makes people sleep with their backs to the walls, or that urge to keep the back of one's neck covered by their blankets when falling asleep. It was deliberately, specifically, the feeling of eyes being fixated upon me. A feeling made more uncomfortable by the fact that from what I could see, there was nobody in the room with me. Exhaustion is a powerful weapon, however, and despite the feeling of how uncomfortable it made me, I was able to eventually get some sleep for the night. The next morning, however, is when things officially started to get weird. You see, I live on the first floor of an apartment complex. The different rooms are laid out in a way that there are 4 separate apartments for each section. 2 rooms on the first floor, and 2 on the second, with a staircase splitting down the middle. and a little stretch of dirt and grass lining the walls of each of the first-floor apartments. I never paid much mind to the stretch of dirt that lay outside my room. I've never been particularly into gardening, so I had no incentive to plant anything there or to attempt to upkeep what remained of the patch of grass that clung desperately to the edge of the concrete walkway. The reason that was the first day I ever showed interest in my little patch of dirt was due to one simple detail that stuck out like an uneven shelf of books. There was a pitch-black hole with the diameter of a golf ball perfectly centered on the patch of dirt right outside my front door. As I locked my door and turned my head to begin walking down the strip of concrete that led to my car, I found my head immediately frozen in place upon noticing it. As I stood there, analyzing it, I felt a cold chill run down the base of my neck, up to the top of my head, and down to my fingertips. I can't describe what it was about the hole that creeped me out. The fact that it was blacker than any shade I had ever seen was a good enough reason, but there were others. The seemingly perfect cylindrical shape of it gave it an unnatural appearance that made it feel like it didn't belong there, more so than it already didn't. However, the reason I felt most unnerved at that moment was due to the simple fact that I had seen this hole before. The day just before that morning, to be specific. This was the same type of hole I had seen yesterday in the park. What the fuck? I thought to myself as I knelt down to get a closer look at the hole. From what I could see, there were no ants, or at least none visible at that moment. Never letting my eyes leave the hole, I reached my hand across the patch of dirt to grab a small twig that just so happened to be there, and began to slowly lower it into the hole. The twig was a good 3 inches long, but yet the hole swallowed it up entirely to the point where I could not stick it any deeper into the hole without my fingers themselves going into the hole itself. Just how deep does this go? I thought to myself. With my body at the complete mercy of curiosity, I again reached over across the patch of dirt, this time picking up a small pebble. I positioned it carefully, calculating exactly where it needed to be dropped to fall perfectly into the hole.
Are you all right?
My thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a firm grip on my shoulder, which caused me to jump damn near out of my skin. I spun around quickly, only to be greeted with my first-floor neighbor, Ron. A very tall, bald man somewhere in his mid-40s, who I'm fairly certain did nothing with his free time besides chew ground beef and lift weights. Not the kind of person you'd necessarily be comfortable with grabbing you out of the blue. Jesus, Ron, you scared the shit out of me, I stammered out between gasps.
Sorry about that, neighbor,
he said in his gravelly southern voice that was so cartoonishly cowboy-esque, you'd swear he'd just done marathoning a collection of Yosemite Sam cartoons.
I called your name about 10 seconds ago, but you seemed so focused on whatever it is you were doing, I guess you didn't hear me,
he said, chuckling to himself. I collected my thoughts, steadied my emotions, and after a few short breaths, responded. Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just checking out this weird-looking hole in the ground. He made a half-hearted attempt to look over my shoulder and take a peek at the odd hole I was talking about, but quickly re-straightened his posture to look back at me.
Well, all right then.
His sentence was shortly interrupted by one of my backup alarms on my phone going off. Upon pulling out my phone, I saw that this alarm in particular was to notify me that I had 10 minutes to be at work. I understand the seeming ridiculousness of setting an alarm so soon to my work start time, but given the number of times I've fallen asleep in the parking lot waiting for my shift to start, it's always better to be safe than sorry. Oh shit. I'm sorry, Ron. Gotta go, I said before quickly running off. He gave me a slight wave as he watched me sprint to my car. However, as I got in my car, threw it into reverse, and began backing up, I neglected to wave back. My gaze remained fixated on the hole in my front yard the entire time I backed out. I wasn't able to make it to work on time. Just barely anyways. Though my complete and total disregard for the very concept of speed limits and a fair share of annoyed honks and middle fingers tossed in my general direction as I dodged and weaved my way through traffic like a snake, I was able to make it to work, only 2 minutes late. Except for the scolding I got from my boss for arriving late, the rest of my workday was pretty uneventful, although I'm not sure if I should attribute that to the mundane nature of the work itself, or if I was just burnt out from the torrent of emotions I had experienced there yesterday. Whatever the cause may have been, however, I was able to get through the rest of the workday without incident. I place emphasis on the rest of the workday because as I pulled back into my apartment parking spot, my eyes immediately locked back onto the dark pit that sat in my front yard like an unnatural blemish. I wasn't even thinking about the whole all day at work or anything. As a matter of fact, I had totally forgotten about the morning incident maybe an hour after arriving at work. Now, my attention immediately drew to the hole because, I don't know. I wish I could explain it, but I can't. The best way I can describe it is like looking at the ocean. Sure, you can look away, but every fiber of your being compels you to continue staring for just a little bit longer. So that's exactly what I did. I stared at the hole for the majority of my walk from my car to my front door, and even when the front door was closed, the image of it remained ever present in my mind. As the night drew near, I got myself ready for bed. I once again found myself uncomfortable with the unshakable feeling of eyes laid upon me. As I brushed my teeth and took my gaze away from the mirror to rinse out my mouth, I got particularly large goosebumps as the feeling grew, seemingly exponentially. It continued to do so as I finally got ready to turn off the lights for bed. However, I was stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed 2 black ants staring at me from outside my window. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's the only way I can describe their behavior. Insects congregating around a window is nothing out of the ordinary. But these were no ordinary bugs. They were undeniably the same ants I had seen that fateful day at the park. Or at the very least, they were the same species. As I approached the window and leaned over to get a better look at them, their posture did not waver. They stood steadfast like statues, staring right back at me. Much like the first day I encountered the creatures, the mere sight of them filled my stomach with a sense of disgust I didn't know the human body was capable of conjuring. It was a deep, primal disgust that seemingly begged my arms to move on their own, to shut the blinds on them and get them out of my sight. I was more than happy to oblige. The feeling of disgust passed. However, as I laid my head down for bed, the feeling of eyes on my back did not. It remained that way through the rest of the night. That was the point where my life took a turn and began to rapidly derail. As I left my apartment the next day, I almost instinctively looked down to check on the anthill in my front yard. Sure enough, there were 2 black ants staring at me. I watched them the entire time I walked to my car. Sure enough, they did the same. Just like the night before on my windowsill. I never left their sight. This time, I did not forget about the incident while I was at work. It didn't hinder my work, but it certainly occupied a large portion of my mind this time around. By the time I pulled back into my driveway later that day, I was hesitant to point my eyes any lower than dead straight ahead of me. I knew they would be there, but that didn't change the fact that I couldn't stand the sight of the vile creatures. However, curiosity is one of humanity's most powerful instincts. I fought it as best I could, but the closer I got to my door, the stronger it became. Inevitably, it took hold of me. Once it did, I noticed that there were now 3 ants guarding the anthill. As always, they stared me down the entire time until I was safely behind my front door. That was when I decided to finally do something about the apparent infestation and called my landlord, Mitchell. "Are you sure it's been growing?" Mitchell asked with a hint of skepticism. "I wouldn't lie to you, man. You know what they say on all those Animal Planet shows? If you see two, there's a whole colony," I retorted with all the confidence in the world. "Isn't that only the same for rat colonies or something?" he said with an even bigger dose of skepticism. "Look, I don't know if the saying applies to all infestations. All I know is that I've been seeing more and more ants show up around my apartment, so clearly they've settled in the area. I'm not asking for much, just an exterminator visit is all, you know? Get his perspective." I said that last line as calmly as I could. I figured the only way to get him to throw me a bone here was by making it not sound like a big, expensive task. He sighed. "All right, man. I got a buddy who works in pest control. I'll tell him to swing by towards the end of his shift for a mock inspection. You have a good night, Alex." And with that, he hung up, sounding mildly annoyed at being convinced to actually do his job. The bane of any landlord's existence, I suppose. The rest of that night went fairly well compared to the previous one. I was feeling very at ease with having a professional come in to help with the situation. On top of that, there were no ants on my windowsill like the previous night. All was right in the world, until I felt the sting. At an ungodly hour of night, I can't even begin to recollect, I awoke to a sharp pain on the stretch of skin between my shoulder and neck. Upon inspection in my bathroom mirror, I found a small red dot was the source of my pain. It hurt like hell, and when I went to touch it, sharp burning pain emitted from it that felt like a lit matchstick being pressed into my skin. I inspected my bed to see if I could spot the culprit. Obviously, my first reaction was to blame my newfound neighbors. I had already grown very tired of them, but bed bugs do exist. I wanted to be thorough and see if it could have been anything else. Despite my investigation efforts, I found nothing and went back to sleep, telling myself that it must just be a strange pimple of some kind, knowing damn well that it wasn't the case. But nonetheless, I was too tired to care at that moment. The next morning, as I left my apartment, I did my now routine checkup on the patch of dirt in front of my apartment. There were 4 of them now. Sure enough, like the night I first encountered them on my windowsill, they watched my every move without so much as taking a step from their apparent guard-like positions. Just like they had done every other time thus far, filled with annoyance at the pests, I kicked up some dirt at them violently in an attempt to get them to run back into their hole. An attempt that was without reward. They didn't move an inch. They stood their ground and watched me intensely from my front door all the way to my car. And even though I couldn't see them while driving out of the parking lot, I still felt their gaze on the back of my neck. When I arrived back home later that day, I was relieved to see the exterminator was already hard at work, crouched down alongside my windowsill, spraying some form of poison along the edges and undersides of my wall. "Hey man, thanks for helping me out," I said as I walked slightly to the side of him whilst twirling my keys. He pulled out his earbuds and looked over at me. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" he uttered. I sighed, rolled my eyes internally, and began again. "This is my place. I struggled to think of the word to describe the procedure the man was in the middle of. "Pest controlling?" I said, shrugging my shoulders. "Oh, you must be Alex," he chuckled to himself. "Yes, sir. I was notified of a possible ant infestation, so I'm just laying some pesticide around all possible entry points of your home. All natural neem oil pesticides, so they're non-toxic to you and any possible pets you may have." I nodded along, pretending to have a clue what he was talking about. "That's awesome, man. Just make sure you get the anthill in front of the yard, too." He leaned his head over past my shoulders to scout the rest of the front yard.
Don't you worry, sir. I'll be sure to hit up every possible entry point, as well as possible nest spots, as I go along," he said with a smile. After about 15 minutes, he knocked on my door, informed me that he was done, and to keep an eye out for any more ants, and left. I breathed a sigh of relief, and quickly had my nerves out to rest. Finally, with some peace of mind, I was able to enjoy the remainder of my night, relaxing with some video games and staying up late due to my day off the following day. All was right in the world, until I laid my head on my pillow and felt the familiar gaze of eyes on the back of my head. The following morning was as mundane could be. After sleeping in for what felt like the first time in weeks, I woke up, went about my morning routine, and sat on my couch watching some TV while thinking about what to do with my day. Eventually settling on going out to see a movie that I wasn't exactly dying to watch. I just couldn't think of anything better to do. A plan that was quickly cut short by the discovery of a new anthill on my front lawn. About a foot away from the original, and closer to my apartment, lay an almost identical-looking copy of the strange anthill that lived rent-free on my lawn for far too long. I was stopped dead in my tracks upon my discovery of it, and was immediately met with a wave of annoyance at its existence. "Fucking Christ, Mitchell, some exterminator friend you've got," I thought to myself. With a deep sigh, I resigned myself to a day of exterminating rather than relaxation, and set off to my local hardware store to buy some bug killer. I wasn't exactly sure what to look for to help deal with my particular infestation. Eventually, however, I settled on a can of bug spray made for ants, as well as a few of those little plastic bait traps that ants are supposed to inadvertently poison the entire colony with. Again, I was not an exterminator by any means, so I had no idea how to go about using the equipment I had just acquired. I figured that if I sprayed a copious amount of the bug spray along the bottom of my door and along my windowsills, that would keep them from entering my apartment. As for the ant bait traps, I just placed one outside both of the two anthills and figured they would have to investigate them eventually. After that little side quest, I was finally able to enjoy the remainder of my day off, or at least a fair portion of it. It was around 7 p.m. when I was sitting on my couch watching TV, just nearly drifting off to sleep, that I felt a sting. It rattled my whole body, from the back of my neck all the way down to the left side of my foot, and caused me to nearly jump out of my skin with pain. I instinctually stood up and threw off my shirt in an attempt to get what I assumed was one of my ant neighbors off of me, and began throwing my shirt over my shoulder to try to swat it off. I did this a few times before realizing I was safe, and there was nothing attached to me. I looked and looked, and there wasn't any ant to be seen on the couch either. I made sure to pull out every cushion, move the couch, and even check the surrounding furniture, and I still found nothing. When I went to investigate my back in the bathroom mirror, I couldn't see a sting mark either. A fact that was not relieving in the slightest. I didn't sleep much that night. I could still feel eyes on the back of my neck, no matter which way I faced, as I tossed and turned. As I woke up the next morning, I had a sense of looming dread hanging over my head that I couldn't shake. A sense of dread that was different, mind you, than the usual morning blues before one gets ready for work. As I closed my front door, I took a deep breath and turned around to check on the anthills. To my complete and utter shock,
No way!
They were gone. I couldn't believe it. For a few moments, I just stood there racking my brain for answers. Did they move out or something? I thought to myself, unable to come up with any rational answers. Did my traps work that fast? Even if they did, the holes wouldn't be this covered up so soon, I thought to myself. My ant traps were still there, looking quite lonely without any trace of an ant colony to accompany them. I chuckled to myself a little bit out of relief that it looked like my infestation problem had taken care of itself, and set out for work. A comforting fact. So why the fuck did I still feel it? That uneasiness I had felt that morning was still there. It hadn't grown. It hadn't decreased. It just remained there. A constant emotion in the back of my mind from the time I woke up, all throughout work. And even now, as I had visual confirmation that my intruders were gone, it remained. I opened my front door and stepped inside. The two black ants sitting on my kitchen table turned their heads to face my direction and stared at me. In an instant, I felt my blood turn to ice and felt a cold chill run down my spine that seemingly paralyzed me in the doorway of my own home. I had never felt so uneasy in my entire life as I did in that moment. As I stood there, frozen with fear, all the moments that had led up to this moment in time raced through my mind. The encounter at the park, the mysterious anthills, the windowsill encounter, and the dread I felt when I looked at those damn bugs all played back in my mind. Something is very wrong here, I thought to myself. These are no ordinary bugs. That much was clear from their appearance alone. I had figured out that much and accepted it long ago. I'm not talking about that, though. On an almost instinctual, primal level that I couldn't comprehend at that moment in time, something was simply very wrong. When I eventually regained my wits, I began to walk past the table to my fridge to retrieve a paper towel. The entire time, their heads followed my every move, and I, in return, did not dare let the cursed insects out of my sight. With one swift motion, I yanked a paper towel off from its roll and smashed the bugs before they could escape. Their smashed remains left an unusual amount of black liquid on my paper towel that seemed unnaturally copious for something so small. I threw their remains away and pulled out my phone. I need the exterminator back here, Mitchell. I don't know what kind of consultation you had this guy run for me, but it clearly wasn't enough, because they're in my fucking house now.
You mean the ants?
He retorted. No, the fucking lawn gnomes. Yes, the ants, Mitchell. Jesus. I spat back at him. He took a long, deep sigh. Even though I had no visual indication, I knew him well and could tell just from his sigh that he was at the very moment rubbing his forehead out of annoyance, like he always did.
All right, I'll call him. Just calm the fuck down, kid. I'll text you his response, okay?
He sounded very irritated at that last remark. Sure, thanks, I said before abruptly hanging up. After about 10 minutes, I got a text from Mitchell that read, "He's all booked up. Says he can do it 2 days from now at the earliest." I replied back almost immediately. 2 days? That's not soon enough, man. You gotta find me someone to get here sooner. He's the cheapest one in town, Alex. He's the one I'm going with. You'll be fine until then. They're just some fucking ants. I threw my phone at the wall out of frustration and slumped against the kitchen counter, almost immediately regretting that decision before frantically going over to check the damage. Just a crack on the screen. As I sat there kneeling, I took a very long, deep breath to clear my head. Okay, I said to myself before standing up and calling in sick to my boss for the following day. The following sick day was spent doing what, in my mind, can only be described as full-on war. I returned from the hardware store with 2 bags in hand that were filled with more of those plastic ant bait traps, stick traps, and bug spray. I spent a good hour placing the various traps throughout my home in high-traffic areas where I thought the ants liked to travel. I sprayed down more bug spray along the windowsill and doorway, and when I was satisfied with that, I laid down even more ant traps. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe 20 traps in total were scattered around my house. A number that is certainly overkill to anyone who isn't privy to my situation. but it wasn't so comically overkill that one would look into my home and one would immediately write me off as a lunatic. I half expected the ants to, at some point, come out and try to stop me, to stand in my way, move my traps, or even commit their usual crime of simply watching me. Not only did none of this occur, however, but I didn't see them at all that day. Not on my kitchen counter, not on my window, not anywhere. As I laid my head down for bed that night, I still felt the now all too familiar eyes on the back of my neck. Aside from that thought, it was like they were finally gone. Whereas the previous day I woke up feeling unbearable dread, the day after, I had gone to war with the ants greeted me with a sense of optimism I had long since forgotten existed. There were, once again, no sign of the cursed bugs anywhere. As I left my house and walked to my car, there were still no anthills to be seen. My ant traps were still laid out in my front yard, and I reminded myself to pick them up when I returned home from work. As I pulled out of my driveway and began driving to work, I found myself in such a good mood that I even found myself singing along a little to the songs on the radio. A state of mind that I truly had not felt in what felt like ages. A feeling that immediately melted away as I noticed an ant crawling around on my hand. Time slowed down, and with what felt like one swift motion, I smacked it off of my hand with the other, causing me to turn my car sharply to the left and nearly end up off the road. I waited for the annoyed honks to pass me by until it was safe to pull over, and once I was able to, I jumped out of my car and began to furiously pat down my body in search for any more ants. I found none, however, except for the now dead one that lay on the dashboard of my car. After removing its corpse from my car, I spent a good 10 minutes checking every nook and cranny of my car to see if I could find any more of them. When, and only when, I was certain that there was absolutely no chance of the insects hiding anywhere in my vehicle, I finally set off to work in complete silence. I honestly don't remember if anybody talked to me at work that day, whether it be because I was so trapped in my own head that I didn't notice anyone's attempts, or because I must have looked like a nervous wreck and simply nobody wanted to. Either way, fear was my only companion that working day. The feeling that used to only accompany me as I laid my head down to sleep at night now made itself present at work. The entire day, I kept randomly slapping my extremities at even the faintest itching sensation. I'm sure I looked like a madman, but I couldn't help it. I was paranoid that they had followed me to work, and at certain points, I even mistook a pain of a random muscle cramp for one of their stings. It was a very long day at work, to say the absolute least. When I pulled back into my apartment driveway, the feeling of being watched grew so intense that it nearly made my eyes water up from the cold chill that ran down my spine. It took me a few seconds to muster up the courage to step out of my car and begin walking to my front door. As soon as I did, I checked my front lawn. Still no anthills. This was not a comforting discovery. I had no more optimism about the situation. I knew that this did not mean they were gone. It simply meant they had moved in. The exterminator comes tomorrow, I told myself in an attempt to remain calm. An attempt that had no hint of sincerity behind it. Pain. Pain was all that I felt as I was ripped out of my sleep at an hour of night I can't even begin to remember. Though it was pitch black in my room and I had no visual confirmation, I knew what the culprit was immediately. The stinging sensation was the same I had felt on the back of my neck many days ago. What was different about this time, however, was the area of effect. It felt like the pain was everywhere on my body, all at once. As quickly as I woke up, and as quickly as I recognized the source of the pain, I leaped out of bed and yanked on my desk lamp cord. My desk lamp fell to the ground, and its light shone straight up at my ceiling, illuminating the room with many mysterious shadows that seemed to surround me from all sides. It was enough light to see my current situation, however. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of the ants had swarmed all over my body. I immediately began to swat, slap, spin, and do everything in my power to shake loose the insects. All the while, they continued to sting me over and over again. They felt like hot staples being driven into my skin, and they were happening multiple times a second. The pain was so excruciating, I felt like I was going to pass out or throw up at any second. As I spun in circles, shaking the ants loose from me, I noticed that there were 2 ants sitting on my nightstand. Just like the day at the park, my house, and my kitchen. They watched me. Despite my frantic and fast movements in all directions, they stood steadfast like statues, watching me writhe around in agony the entire time. I eventually had gotten enough of them off of me to the point where I could grab the can of ant spray I kept in the corner of the room. Almost instantly, I felt the stinging stop. The pain didn't, but I could feel no new stings occurring. As I looked down, I noticed the ants fleeing from me. The ants on the nightstand were no longer there, and the ones who were just attacking me a moment ago were now scurrying across the floor, away from me as fast as they could. They weren't fast enough. They were resilient, though. On average, I'd say each ant took about a 3-second spray to fully stop moving.
Take that!
I honestly think I used up half the damn bottle that night. It's not like I was in any state of mind to have used the thing sparingly. I simply held down the spray button, and I didn't let go until I saw no more signs of life in my room. When it was finally over, I counted 85 stings all over my body. They covered my chest, arms, legs, back, and neck. It took a little while, but after I was done cleaning the ant corpses from my room, I decided to take a hot bath to try to soothe my writhing body, and promptly passed out in my bathtub from the pain. I awoke to the sound of a knock on my front door, followed by a familiar, "Hello?" It took a few moments for me to comprehend my situation. I had a splitting headache like I'd never felt before. The pain from my stings might not have been as severe as they were last night, but it was still present. On top of all this, I had fallen asleep in my bathtub and had slept in such an agonizing weird angle that my legs had fallen completely asleep. On top of all this, I now had a severe neck cramp. I swear, it took all the willpower in my body just to recognize that the person knocking at my door was the exterminator. And with all the energy I could muster, I shouted as loud as I could, "I'll be right there!" Luckily, my bathtub is a piece of shit. Over the course of the night, my water had slowly drained off by itself, so I wasn't a completely sopping wet, pruny mess. It still took me a few minutes to eventually open the door for the exterminator, though, as I had to get dressed, down 3 aspirin, and splash some cold water on my face. "Are you okay there?" he said as I opened the door. I imagine that my delayed response, coupled with the ghastly appearance, I must have aroused a fair amount of concern. "Hey man, I'm sorry for taking so long. I had a rough night and slept in," I said while reeling from the sunlight that was now piercing my eyes and seemingly stabbing me in the brain in a way that caused me to wince in pain. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, sir," he said, sounding genuinely concerned. "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" I told him the story as I walked him to my room, neglecting to tell him the part about the ants standing on my nightstand, watching the entire event occur. "Oh my word, that sounds awful. Well, don't you worry, sir. I'll make sure we take care of this problem today," he said, patting my shoulder in an attempt to comfort me. As he began to inspect my room, he noted a number of ant traps I had strewn about my house. With a slightly concerned tone, he told me, "If you've already taken all these actions that you say you have, then my only conclusion is they must have a nest somewhere in the walls or maybe even the floorboard." We talked for a little bit about the options and where to proceed. eventually deciding to drill holes into my walls at key locations to lay down bait traps and spray pesticides. Once he was done, he bid me farewell and left. I followed shortly after and headed to work. As I arrived back at my house later that day, I instinctively checked the stretch of dirt outside my front door. When I did so, I found 2 new anthills. Fear, annoyance, and any other emotion I had felt towards my intruders up until that point all faded away and were replaced with pure, unadulterated rage. "God damn it!" I shouted before kicking up dirt all over the hills. "God fucking damn it!" I shouted a little louder as I began to viciously stomp on the 2 anthills over and over again, to the point where I swear, if there was some sort of cave underneath the hills, I would have broken through the earth itself and fallen in. After about 7 good stomps, I found myself a little out of breath, and while standing over the hills, turned to face the road. A woman who was walking her dog stood there with a look of confusion mixed with a hint of fear. I raised my hand to attempt to explain myself, but before I could do so, she fled down the sidewalk, leaving me alone with my unwanted guests. "Fuck," I muttered to myself before kicking dirt over the now decimated anthills and heading inside. I couldn't get to sleep that night. I remember specifically the feeling of being watched was more intense that night than it had been up until that point. It mattered not if I faced the wall, away from it, or straight up. I couldn't evade it. With a deep sigh and a rub of my eyes, I resigned myself to go watch some TV for a few hours in hopes of passing out somewhere down the road. I sat on the edge of my bed and turned on my nightstand lamp. As the light illuminated my room, I could now see my surroundings. I spotted them. Just like the night before, there were once again 2 sentinel ants watching me from my nightstand. Remembering the horror of the night before, I immediately patted down my body, expecting to be covered in ants once again. I quickly realized, however, that there were none to be found. I slowly turned my gaze up from my body to the ants and knelt forward to get a closer look at them. They stood there, staring back at me, and soon enough it was as if we were both analyzing each other. "What the fuck are you?" I muttered to myself. I stretched my hand out and hovered it above the ants in an attempt to get them to move. They didn't. "Why don't you react?" I asked as I began to rapidly move my hand back and forth above them. Finally, in a bit of frustration, I stood up and made a swatting motion towards the ants, like I was about to smash them into the table. They finally reacted and moved backwards to avoid my hand. I stopped my hand midair, however, and chuckled to myself. "I got you, little bastards," I said, moving my hand backwards. The ant stood there, staring back at me. After a few seconds that seemed to drag on for hours, I laughed to myself about the craziness of what was happening. Eventually, I shook my head to snap myself out of the never-ending staring contest and went to the floor by the foot of my bed to grab a can of bug spray. When I turned around to rid myself of the ants, however, they were gone, as if they saw what I was about to do and fled before I could take action. I spent the remainder of that night watching god-awful late-night television, eventually passing out somewhere around 3 a.m. The sound of my backup alarm going off finally woke me up. I immediately recognized it as the alarm I used when I would sleep in at the parking lot of the car wash. "Oh shit," I muttered to myself before rolling off my couch and making a mad dash for my keys and shoes. I had 10 minutes to be at a place that was nearly a 25-minute drive away. As I started speeding my way to work, in a vain attempt to somehow make it there in time, I began to rehearse my "I'm sorry" speech to my boss. I say began because I was quickly interrupted by the sensation of a sting on the back of my neck. Then another, and another, and another. Just like 2 nights ago, I began to feel stinging all over my body. I jerked and twisted my body in response to the newfound pain, but it did little to ease my situation. I started to see them crawling all over my hands and arms. How they had gotten into my car was a question I couldn't begin to think about at the moment in time. I looked into the rearview mirror and could see them all over my neck and shoulders. They were swarming me and stinging me all over my body. Once the realization of what was going on settled into my mind and the pain began to permeate every square inch of me, I started wildly swatting all over my body in a vain attempt to free myself from the ants, causing my car to begin swerving erratically all over the road. A particularly large sting nipped me in my patch of skin between my left shoulder and neck. Acting on pure instinct, I lunged over to attempt to swat the ant stinging me there. When I did so, the motion of my arm caused my elbow to lean across the steering wheel and send my already speeding car straight into one of those old oak trees that lined the road. I awoke in the hospital a few hours later with a cast on my right forearm and a headache that made the one from the day before seem like a fleeting memory. The doctors told me that I had a concussion, a fractured rib, and had broken my wrist in 3 spots upon impact with the tree. When they asked me what happened, I opened my mouth to tell them, but quickly closed it as I realized that the pain from the stings was completely gone. I pulled up the medical robe I was in and looked down at my chest. There was nothing. No sting marks or any other indication that the ants had ever attacked me in the car. How long was I out? I asked the doctor.
You've been knocked out for about,
He stopped to pull up his watch.
8 hours now.
Did the stings fade away that fast? I thought to myself. They were gone in the morning yesterday, too. I thought to myself for a moment about what to say. I fell asleep at the wheel, I said, trying to sound as honest as I could. There was no proof that I was attacked by the vile creatures. They had made sure of it. I couldn't tell them I was swarmed by and attacked by ants when there was no proof of the event ever occurring. They'd think I was high or something.
That's what we thought,
he said as he began to write into his clipboard.
Your blood work came back clear of alcohol, so we figured it had to be something else. Well, son, you're gonna be getting all the sleep you could ever dream for. When you never showed up to work, your boss called your phone, and we answered it for you. We told him what happened, and he told us to tell you that you're going to be getting 2 weeks of paid leave while you recover a little. He said he'll have you doing light duty when you get back. Something about a cash register, I think?
I chuckled to myself and nodded. After a day of evaluation, I was allowed to return home. I had to call a taxi, however. My car was rendered undrivable by the accident. As I opened the door to my home, dread didn't even begin to describe the emotion that swept over me like a tidal wave. It was the most soul-crushing sense of impending doom I had ever known in my entire life. As I closed my front door, it only grew more intense. After a few moments of standing there, taking in the dimly lit apartment, I slowly lowered myself into my couch and stared at the powered-off TV. As I did so, I spotted the ant that was running along the top of my TV. A newfound sense of anger boiled up within me, and with one swift motion, I grabbed my TV remote and chucked it at the ant. I had to use my left hand, however, due to the cast, which caused the remote to fly dead center at my TV screen, resulting in my TV being now effectively dead. I sat there in stunned silence for a few moments before dropping to my knees and beginning to hyperventilate. Think, man. think, I said to myself between strained breaths, trying to calm myself down. What the fuck do I do? I exclaimed in a vague hope some invisible higher power would tell me the answer and rid me of this nightmare. But no such enlightenment came, and I had finally caught my breath. I sat back against the bottom of the couch and called the exterminator once more. So, what are my options now? I asked after informing him that the ant problem had still not gone away.
Well, if the infestation truly has lingered on this long, my suggestion would be attempting fumigation of your apartment,
he said. Fumigation? I asked.
Yes, sir. The only two problems with that being is that 1, it's a very lengthy and expensive process, and 2, since you're in an apartment complex with other tenants living around you, you would need to get them to sign off on it. Specifically, you would need at least 2 neighboring tenants to sign off on having the infestation along with you. That way, we could fumigate the whole apartment block that you're on.
I sat there in silence for a moment, contemplating who to ask for a signature, and also contemplating whether or not the fumigation would even work at all.
Ask your neighbor for their signature, sir. As soon as you've gotten them, give me a call back and I'll work out the details for the procedure with your landlord,
he said, sounding a bit impatient with my silence. Will do, I muttered before placing my phone down and sinking deeper into the floor. I could still see the ant watching me from the top of the TV. I walked by it and headed to my bedroom to sleep. It was all I wanted to do at that moment. I was awoken a few hours later by a voice whose origin I had no earthly idea where it came from.
Who's there?
I looked around my room but saw nothing. After sitting upright in my bed, staring into the darkness of my room for a few seconds, I shrugged it off as a dream and reluctantly slowly lowered my head back down onto my pillow. The second I made contact with it, I heard it again.
I said wake up.
The voice sounded annoyed this time. I willingly obeyed its command, and with one motion shot straight up out of bed and turned on my light, half expecting to see an axe-wielding murderer of some kind standing beside me. I was taken aback to discover no indication of life inside my room. After sitting in the light for a few tense moments, I began to feel my eyes water up as a cold chill ran down my spine. The feeling of eyes on the back of my neck was so strong, I swear it was as if someone had placed a blanket over it. I wanted nothing more in that moment than to cower back into my bed and hide under the covers. But I knew what I had heard. Someone was in my house, and I had to protect myself. I slowly opened my dresser drawer and took out my only means of protecting myself in that given moment. A small Leatherman multi-tool, retracted the pitiful small knife attachment from it, and began to sweep my house. I took it one room at a time. Bedroom, clear. Hallway, clear. Bathroom, clear. One at a time, I made sure every square inch of my house was without any intruder. Eventually, I checked everywhere. Every room of my house lay baked in light, yet I found no one. This did nothing to calm my fears. As I stood in the center of my hallway, I turned my head to the side, knife hand outstretched. I began to listen for any movement of the intruder. The voice whispered. I spun around so fast I didn't have time to bend my arm inward, and when I swung, I ended up leaving a cut mark on the left side of my hallway wall. There was no one there. I quickly spun back around the other way and began to slowly back myself out of the hallway and into the living room to make a break for the front door. When I reached the end of the hallway, I thought I stopped dead in my tracks. The feeling of eyes was so strong at this point that I no longer felt it on my neck. was everywhere. My entire body shuddered with fear, as everywhere all at once, on my body, it felt like I was being watched. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there frozen. Had the chill running down my spine not paralyzed me with fear, I might have been able to taste the salt of my tears that were now running down both of my eyes. It was, however, not a factor at all at the moment. The only thing on my mind was a primal instinct to sprint for the door and leave. Yet I just stood there.
You took our home, Alex. It's only fair we get to take yours.
Who's there? The voice spoke. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to make a run for it, but the voice sounded so close to me that, for all I knew, the intruder was right behind me, blocking off the door. Where the fuck is he? I thought to myself, where are you? I began to ask the question out loud, as intimidatingly as I could muster at that moment, when I was struck with a sudden epiphany. The voice sounded like it was right on top of me. I slowly turned my gaze to the right side of my body. The ant, sitting on my shoulder, stared back at me.
Alex.
The ant said once more. I felt bile rise in the back of my throat, but forced it back down as I swiftly swatted the ant off of me and dropped to the floor. Crawling back and watching it from the hallway wall, for a while it struggled on its back, but eventually it found its equilibrium and got back onto its feet, staring at me for only a few moments before running under my couch and leaving me alone with my thoughts and fears. Soon after, the ant fled from my sight, and I went to the bathroom to vomit. I slept in the bathtub that night. I didn't plan on doing so, but I spent so long hiding there that exhaustion must have eventually seized me. The following day was spent living in what I can only begin to describe as all-encompassing fear. I quite simply just didn't know what to do. A part of me didn't believe the event of last night had truly happened at all and had chalked it up to a bad dream. The other part of me thought I was crazy. Even the smallest part of my psyche that believed the ordeal last night had occurred didn't know what to do. So I did nothing. So, for a long time, I sat in my living room, trying to watch TV through the bottom left peephole. That was the only part of the device that was still working anymore. I wasn't even truly trying to watch TV. Most of my mental energy was spent scanning the corners of my vision for any sight of the creatures and trying to think of a plan. After a few hours of anxiety-filled torment, I pulled out my phone and began to look for apartment ads near me. Nothing, I thought to myself. To be more specific, nothing within my affordability. As I thought the words to myself, I quickly found my thoughts interrupted by a familiar voice.
Run, if you wish. We will follow. You owe us a home.
The voice spoke. I quickly scurried away from my couch and sat in the corner of my living room floor as I attempted to make out the source of the voice. I felt my heart sink into the bottom of my stomach when I realized the voice was coming from all around me at once, as if my own walls were talking to me. Not knowing what to do, I went to lie down in the bathtub. Like the night before, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion because the next thing I remember was waking up freezing from being in the tub so long. For a while, I sat there contemplating what to do. I eventually pulled out my phone and called up Mitchell.
Alex, how are you, man?
He asked.
I heard about the accident you got into. I tried calling a couple days ago, but you must have not heard me or something.
I'm fine, Mitchell, I interrupted. Thanks for the concern. Listen, I was wondering if you had any other exterminators you could call, or, I don't know, Just somebody else who might actually be willing to help me out? He said nothing at first.
Exterminator? You mean for that ant problem you said you were having?
After a few seconds of annoyed silence on my half, I spoke up. Yeah, that ant problem. Listen, the guy you've been having see me hasn't really helped the problem at all. He says he could fumigate the apartment block, but I'd have to get people to—
Fumigate?
He interrupted, sounding very surprised.
Whoa. Slow down there, bud. Nobody's fumigating anything.
Look, I know it's an expensive procedure, and God forbid you actually help take care of your tenants, Mitchell, but I have a serious problem at my apartment, and your guy hasn't done shit for me. I yelled back at him.
My guy happens to be a very respected exterminator, kid,
he said, sounding very annoyed.
If he says we gotta fumigate, then by all means, we'll fumigate. But not until you offer up some solid fucking evidence of an infestation.
What? I asked.
I like to think I've been very patient with you and this entire situation, Alex. But I'm done wasting my exterminator's time with routine checkups to your apartment.
He said. What are you talking about? I asked.
What am I talking about? Kid, the guy didn't want to be rude to your face and say you didn't have a problem. The truth is, though, that the last 2 times he's been over there, he's called me back to complain about you wasting his time with an imaginary ant problem. He said that every time he's been over to your place, he's never found any ant or sign of him being there.
He said. That's not... I began before stopping mid-sentence.
Alex, are you all right?
He asked softly. I hung up and set off to talk to my neighbors. Nope. Are you okay? You look terrible. Also, nope. These were essentially the answers I got from everyone in my apartment block. Not even my next-door neighbor said they had seen any sign of an ant infestation. The closest I got was one guy who lived 2 doors down, saying he saw ants outside his house last week, but that was it. I didn't have the signatures I needed to get the fumigation approved. I didn't have anywhere to go. With no other options, I went back to my apartment and slowly sank into the couch. The way the living room lights illuminated my surroundings made my reflection very visible on the broken TV. The crack mark lay situated over the right side of my face. As I stared deeply into the TV, I found my eyes going fuzzy, as if I were staring off into the space behind the TV. As I did this, I noticed the ants crawling up my legs from my reflection. Without ever once physically looking down at my body, I just stared straight ahead and watched them slowly swallow me up to my abdomen. It was as if I was disassociating from the world. The ants crawled even higher, never once stinging me, just slowly enveloping my body. They eventually stopped once they reached my shoulders. Without actually looking down, it was impossible to tell, but there had to be at least 1,000 of them on me.
We are your problem, not theirs.
The ants all seemed to speak in unison. My fugue-like state was quickly broken, and reality came crashing down onto me like an anvil from up high as I stood straight up and began to swat them all away. When they all were finally off of me, I stood there and watched them scatter in all directions to safety. Once they were all gone, the voice spoke from all directions yet again.
So be it.
I clenched my one good hand into a fist and screamed out in a mixture of frustration, fear, and anger that all seemed to rise up at once. Get out of my house! I screamed before going into the kitchen to grab a hammer from under the sink. Get the fuck out of here! I yelled as I swung the hammer into the wall above my living room couch. Where the fuck are you, little demons? Get out! I screamed as I swung the hammer from wall to wall. Occasionally, I would see a few of the ants in the holes I created before they would quickly scurry deeper into the walls to evade me. I attempted to hit them as soon as I saw them, but they were fast, and more often than not, my hammer missed the same spot, and I would just end up leaving a fresh hole instead. How long this went on for, I honestly don't recall. I was locked in the jaws of anger and completely at its mercy. The only thing I wanted at that moment was the death of the ants who had tormented my life and invaded my sanctity for far too long. I only stopped due to the pounding on my door.
What the fuck is going on in here?
My neighbor Ron yelled at me through the door, sounding very annoyed.
Sounds like a damn tornado over here.
I placed the hammer on the table and opened the door. Hey, Ron. I was quickly interrupted.
Don't you hey Ron me? What the fuck is going on in this house? Sounds like you were trying to tackle your way through the damn wall.
I'm sorry, I began. I was just trying to kill a few ants. He stared at me in disbelief for a few seconds before speaking.
Ants? Could have told me you were fighting a tiger in here. I'd have believed you too.
I know. I'm sorry, I said, choked up with embarrassment. Ron's sudden arrival had completely snapped me out of my rage-fueled haze, and as I looked to my left to survey my handiwork, I was now appalled by the scene I had created in my home. We stared at each other for a few more moments, as I couldn't think of anything else to say other than feeble apologies. Eventually, I said the only thing I could think of. Ron, you haven't seen any ants around your home, have you? He looked over my shoulder, and judging from the widening of his eyes and the pale look on his face, it was safe to assume he could see what I had done, too.
No, I haven't,
he said, slowly backing up.
If I hear you going apeshit like that ever again, so help me, I will call the cops, Alex.
With that, he backed all the way up into his apartment and left me there alone in the doorway. I slowly closed the door, took a few steps back into my living room, and dropped to my knees. As soon as I did so, the walls began to start murmuring. I once again decided to make a phone call.
Hello, Alex? Is that you?
My boss asked.
What can I do for you? You're supposed to be resting.
Yeah, I know, I replied. Listen, I know I still have about a week's worth of leave, but do you think it would be okay if I came back to work early? I've been feeling really cooped up, and I just really need to get out of this house and focus on something else.
Something other than what?
He asked. Something other than TV? I replied weakly. He took a deep breath and said,
Well, you know I'd never turn down help around the car wash, but unfortunately, you coming back early would be a liability.
A liability? I asked. The murmuring had grown louder.
Yeah, a liability.
He reiterated.
The hospital said you need at least a week of rest. If I were to let you come back to work and you hurt yourself somehow, I'd be held accountable for it.
Sir, please let me come back. My eyes began to start watering. I promise you, I'll be extra careful. I'll do car register duty or whatever else you think is safest. Just please, let me come back early. I begged him. He replied,
I'm sorry, kid, but no can do. You enjoy your rest. I'll see you next week.
Wait, I said before being cut off by the click of him hanging up. I chucked the phone across the room and watched it shatter as it hit the kitchen wall and slowly crawled backwards to rest my head against the front door. From where I was sitting, I could see a dozen ants or so devouring the half-eaten bag of chips on my kitchen table. With one more option at my disposal and a newfound sense of hopelessness, I ignored the ants and walked to my bedroom to go to sleep. What else was there to do? I didn't go to sleep that night. I just lay there flat on my bed, staring straight up at my ceiling. The murmuring in the walls had never ceased. It continued on and on for a couple of hours until eventually, all at once, it stopped. No more whispers or indistinguishable voices could be heard from all around me anymore. I took a deep breath and rolled over to face away from the wall and finally tried to get some sleep. My plans were interrupted by the discovery of a single ant watching me from my nightstand. Almost immediately, I shot out of bed and stood up. For a few tense seconds, I spoke to it first. "I'm sorry. Is that what you want to hear? I'm sorry. I destroyed your home. I'm sorry." The ant said nothing. It just stared back at me. "Say something," I shouted at it impotently. "What do you want from me?" After a few more seconds of silence, the ant finally spoke.
You owe us a new home, Alex.
As soon as the words were spoken, the murmuring began again, only not from any of my walls this time, but from one clearly identifiable origin point. The voices coming from my bed. As I made this discovery, I slowly opened my dresser drawer and pulled out my Leatherman pocket knife and one of my many cans of bug spray and slowly approached the side of the bed. The ant on my dresser moved closer to inspect what I was doing, but said nothing. With the bug spray being held out in my damaged arm, I aimed it at the bed and slowly began to cut a hole in the side of my mattress. As the seams of it came apart, I was met with the discovery of a sea of black, made up of hundreds of thousands of ants that began to rapidly dart away in all directions. I immediately recoiled in disgust, and as I dropped to the floor, I began to spray the poison wildly in front of me, desperate to kill the ants. My actions were quickly interrupted by a loud voice that spoke with more malice and hatred than I ever knew existed in the world.
You will not harm another nest.
As the voice spoke, I felt the walls around me start to rumble. As they did so, the murmuring grew louder, and before I could even register what the ants' voices were saying, a large black tentacle shot out of the hole I had cut into the side of the mattress. It lashed out at me like the fingers of Satan himself, and as it swat across my chest, I was able to see that it wasn't a tentacle at all. It was hundreds of thousands of ants all coalesced into a single tentacle-like shape. The tentacle writhed and swung wildly at me, but maintained its shape the entire time. As I lay there on the floor looking up in horror, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The ants were moving like they shared consciousness. Acting on instinct, I scrambled back onto one knee and began to dose the massive ants with a can of bug spray. This had seemingly no effect, however. Apart from the few dozen ants falling to the floor, the ants held their structure steady. After a few seconds of my retaliation, the tentacle quickly shot even further out of the mattress and began to grow and grow and grow. Never taking my finger off of the spray button, I simply fell back onto the floor in horror as I watched the tentacle morph into an indistinguishable black tidal wave that began to envelop my entire field of vision, and soon after my legs. The stinging began almost immediately, and as the pain in my legs became so intense, I felt like I was going to pass out. The murmuring turned into screaming. I wish I could recall what they were saying, I really do. At that moment, however, I was encompassed by a primal instinct that limited my mental capacity to one task: run. I rapidly began to scoot back, kicking my legs the entire time to get the ants off of me. The entire time, more ants poured out of my mattress and made the tidal wave of ants grow even higher and higher. As soon as I was able to get to my feet, I turned and ran for the door. As I did so, I could hear the collective of ants behind me growing louder and louder. With one swift motion, I swung the door open, and as I stepped out into the safety of my lit hallway, the voices reached their height, and in one last act of defiance,
Alex.
They spoke before being cut off as I slammed the bedroom door shut. The second I did so, the voices immediately stopped. No more murmuring, no more rustling of the ants. It all simply stopped at once. I propped a chair against the bedroom door and hunkered down in my bathroom for the night. Which finally leads us here, the present. Ever since that night, I've been holding up in my kitchen. I've consolidated what remaining cans of bug spray remained in my home, and I've been sitting with my back to the corner of the wall for the last 3 days, waiting for the swarm to return. It hasn't yet, but I can't give them an opportunity to sneak up on me. I can't risk falling asleep and letting them get me. I can't risk them getting anyone else. These demons cannot be allowed to spread. I won't let them. As I've been writing this over the last hour, the gas valve on my stove has been running the entire time. I don't know if the ants know what I'm planning, but I do know that the murmuring has returned, and over the last hour, it's been growing louder and louder. There's a lighter in my kitchen drawer, and as soon as I submit this story, I'm going to use it to destroy these creatures once and for all. There's a shared fire alarm system in my apartment block. I pulled it about 5 minutes ago, and I sincerely hope everyone within range has gotten out. I can't wait any longer. The feeling of eyes on my neck has returned, and even though I've grown immune to the paralyzing effect it had on me, I know what it means. The ants are watching me. They know what I'm planning, and will surely try to stop me. I'm sorry. If there were any words of wisdom I have left in my tattered shell of a psyche, I doubt they would be of any worth. The only thing I can think of to impart onto you is this. We like to think that we're the masters of our domain, but the sobering reality is that we are the masters of nothing. The creatures that inhabited this earth before us will continue to do so long thereafter. Leave them be, and if you're lucky, they will do the same. And for the love of God, stay away from Anthills.
That was Anthills by Breiterman, brought to life by Felipe Ojeda. Felipe, what's your take on this story? It's such a unique blend of psychological horror and natural terror.
It really is, Geoff. And you know guys like us have a couple screws loose ourselves, so it's easy to see why I picked it. I loved how the story taps into that primal disgust we feel towards insects, while weaving in themes of isolation and paranoia. The escalation from a single anthill to a full-blown nightmare was brilliantly executed.
Couldn't agree more. And before we wrap up, let's remind our listeners where they can find more of your work.
Oh, absolutely. You can find me on YouTube at TheGhostOf94. Also on X, Reddit, and Instagram under the same name. And don't forget, tomorrow, I'll be premiering Craig Groshek's original story on my channel. It's going to be a fantastic event, and I hope everyone tunes in.
Listeners, don't forget to check out Felipe's work and let him know you heard him here on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. And don't forget, you can support Chilling Tales for Dark Nights by leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening. Watching on YouTube? Give us a thumbs up, drop a comment, and subscribe, of course, so you never miss an episode. For more terrifying content, visit chillingtalesfordarknights.com to become a patron and enjoy all our episodes ad-free. Your support keeps the nightmares alive. I'm Geoff Sturtevant, and it's been my pleasure to guide you through tonight's terrifying tales. Don't forget, we'll be welcoming a new guest narrator each Wednesday, so stay tuned for next week's surprise guest, where they and we will once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet
dreams.
Gotta get some water, Geoff.